I thought I would just start by asking a biographer the worst possible question for a biographer, which is to tell me about yourself. Um, I wanted to know, David, before you went abroad and lived abroad for a while, um, you were interested in a very particular kind of writing as a young person, no?
I can't really think of any particular kind of writing. I remember
Where did you grow up, David?
I grew up in Peekskill, New York, up the river a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was an Episcopal clergyman.
Mm-hmm.
And I did all the things I was supposed to do as a good white boy,
Mm-hmm.
growing up in the 19 whatever it was,
Right.
30s
50s.
and 40s.
Yeah.
And I went to college. I went to Princeton. And the kind of writing I did, what I remember most about writing at Princeton was that my advisor read my first paper, and the comment at the bottom was very interesting about meandering rivulets. D. See me.
Very, very interesting, demanding rivulets.
Yeah, it was a line from a poem.
Yes.
Yes.
And gave him a D.
He gave me a D.
Yes.
And suggested that I see him, and then he took me in hand and actually worked on my writing.
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of writing that I do now, if I'm not writing about mythology, which you mentioned,
Yes.
the writing that I'm most interested in is the biographical writing. You asked about me. Well, I've done a kind of autobiography too, which as a kind of exercise, but not for a publication. But
That's different.
you can look at it.
I would love to.
All right.
How did you, when you did your undergraduate degree at Princeton, and then you went on to graduate school before Turkey?
No, after Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
After the first period in Turkey, I came back and did graduate work at NYU for my doctorate. But
how did you end up abroad?
I needed a change. I guess the life I had lived up to that point. Well, I went to the teacher placement bureau at Princeton, and a woman who was running it said she had a job for me at a friend's school in Philadelphia. But then she said, but why would you want to do that? You grew up in a prep school. Your father was a headmaster. Why don't you go to Turkey? And she found me this job that existed at Robert College in Turkey. And so I went there, and
were you going to teach English, or?
I did teach English.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the first thing I had to teach was David Copperfield.
Oh, no.
If you can imagine teaching David Copperfield to 14-year-old Turkish students.
Yes.
That's what I did. I had no choice in the matter. That's what I was told.
Yes.
I was teaching. But then, a few years into that stay, my life changed radically. I mean, up to that time, I was on the sort of path that was generally acceptable and to my parents and to my way of life. Then I was invited to a party, and somebody came to me at the party. It was a Turkish friend, and he said, Jimmy's here, and he wants to see what Americans in Istanbul are like. So go into the kitchen. So I went into the kitchen, and my life changed. It's hard for anybody to believe that, but my life really did change at that moment. He was sitting at a counter, and a kitchen counter, and he had a yellow pad, and he was scribbling on it. And I looked over his shoulder, and it said Istanbul, December, whatever it was, 19th or 20th, whatever it was, 1961, right. And he had just finished the last words of his novel, Another Country.
At the party.
Yeah, I didn't know that at the time because I didn't know what he was writing.
Yes.
And he didn't pay any attention to me when he was writing, obviously. And I was not so foolish as to talk to him while he was writing. And he finished, and he turned around and he said, "I'm Jimmy, who are you?" And I said, "I'm David." And he said, "David, I like that name." Oh, later on, I would know.
Because of his brother.
What he meant. His brother, his stepfather, the main character, or one of the main characters in Giovanni's Room, the main character in the Amen Corner. It's a name that he uses over and over again. I never really talked to him about that. But in any case, that was my meeting with James Baldwin.
I want to go back for a second, David, and ask you. You said there's a sort of several years there when you were in Istanbul. Did you have any plan other than teaching at this school plan about staying or not staying? Or
I had plans about not staying after Baldwin came back several times during my last 2 years there, in the first segment that I was there. And I told him that I wanted to do graduate work and that I wanted to do it on Henry James. Well, he said Henry James is probably my favorite American author. And so we talked a lot about Henry James. And he said, well, I said, I'll have to get a job because I can't afford just to live in New York. So he said, well, how about if you worked for me in my office that I'm setting up on West End Avenue? This was a period of, the central period for civil rights, so-called actions, that he was very much involved with. And so I did that. And I did correspondence, I answered letters, I sorted his papers, I did whatever sort of needed to be done. And sometimes I traveled with him.
What was that experience like for you to?
Well, it was exciting and it was educative, obviously. I could give you an example.
Please.
For example, you'll be interested in this because it has to do with myths.
Yes.
We were at a speech, he was giving a speech at Harvard. And at the question and answer period, a boy, a young man, said, "Mr. Baldwin, can you tell me what we're going to do about the Negro problem?" And he looked just amazed. If you knew him, when he became stirred up by something, his eyes would get bigger and bigger. And he turned to this poor kid and said, "It's not a Negro problem, baby. It's a white problem. And I'm only black because you think you're white." Well, I learned a lot from that answer and how he dealt with the whole question of the myth of whiteness and the myth of blackness.
Was it something that the questions, they're not so much rhetorical as I think what he's responding to and what you were responding to in that moment was that it wasn't so much a question or rhetorical even. It's almost sort of asking him to explain the listener.
To explain
the person asking the question.
Oh, right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
What
he was using that person as
Yeah.
a way of talking about something very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was it ever to be quote unquote representative at that time? Was it something that felt burdensome to him ever?
To Baldwin?
Yes.
I think so, in a way.
Yeah.
When we get to talk about Beauford Delaney and how he's related to Baldwin, we'll certainly talk about that, because we have to talk about the question of love and what he means by love, which has to do with not only his brother David or me or anybody else, but also the kid who asked the question.
Yes.
The answer was harsh, but the answer was an answer of love. I think when Baldwin talked about love, he talked about how difficult it was, that love is hard work. Love isn't what you read on your Hallmark card that you get for your birthday, you know. And Beauford Delaney was the person who I think first suggested that to Baldwin.
Meaning that love was an action.
Yes.
Right? And so if you are involved with someone on any level, even people that you pass on the street, this is often something that we read in the novels.
Yeah.
There are scenes where someone is walking and they pass people on the street, and the question of how and why to connect always comes up in group scenes and obviously in intimate scenes. But when you were with him, I think to read, which you must read David's biography, one of the things that is very poignant about that book and your biography of Beauford is the connection and the responsibility of love. One of the first stories that David tells in the Beauford book is Baldwin asked him to go pick Beauford up.
Right.
Would you like to tell that story?
Sure.
This
yeah.
is in 1966, I think.
Yes, right. Baldwin and I had gone to Istanbul and were sort of setting up house there with the idea of staying for, an indefinite time until he had to go somewhere else for some other reason.
The speaking was also a way to make a living at that point, yes?
Yes, except in a way he had moved to Turkey with the idea that he would not speak for a while. That he would find a time of quiet and he would finish the novel that he was working on at the time. Now I've forgotten where we... Beauford.
Yes, 66 in Turkey.
Yes, right. I had saved money and was going to buy a car, and he was going to help pay for it. We were going to have a car together in Istanbul because we often wanted to go into the city, and it was complicated given where we lived. So we were getting a car, and I was taking part of his manuscript to New York first for his publisher to look at. And then I was to come back to Paris, pick up the car, and drive to Istanbul, which it was a little tricky, but all right, I accepted that. But then he complicated the whole issue by saying, "And would you pick up Richard in London?" Well, I knew who Richard was. Richard was a lover of his whom he had met in London the year before, and I had met him on our way to Turkey, I think it was. So, yes, it was complicated.
Yes.
So he
What
said,
kind of person was Richard that you...
Richard was a madman. Richard, when you were driving along, he didn't look at the castles on the hill, when you're driving through Europe or to Yugoslavia or whatever it was. He what he looked at was, say, a tin can that was on the road, and he'd stop and he'd say, "It is beautiful." So this was sort of the atmosphere. But I'm leaving out one important point. Baldwin asked me to please stop in Paris, along with picking up Richard in London, to pick up Beauford Delaney in Paris. I said, Beauford Delaney, I'd heard him talk about Beauford Delaney, but I didn't know anything about him or who he was. So I said, well, can you tell me a little bit about him if I'm going to, pick him up? First of all, you got to tell me where to find him in Paris, which was not easy. And then I had to pick up Richard, who had somehow left the car in Paris and was seeing some friends, and I didn't quite know where. But anyway, Jimmy said, and excuse me for calling him Jimmy, but that's what everybody who knew him called him. And I feel uncomfortable sounding like an academic and saying, Baldwin said this and that, Anyway, so Jimmy said, would you pick up Beauford Delaney? So I said, fine, but who is he? And he said, oh, don't worry about it. He's a cross between Brer Rabbit and Francis of Assisi. That didn't help me very much. But in the end it did, because sometimes Beauford was like Francis of Assisi, sometimes he was like Brer Rabbit, and it was, you never knew. Yes. And what Jimmy had neglected to tell me was that Beauford had severe mental problems and that sometimes sort of exploded, schizophrenic, paranoid problems. So I went to where he told me Beauford lived. And this was a kind of old Zola-esque building in Montparnasse. And I came to the doorway, and there was a woman, and just like the novels, the woman was all dressed in black, and she was very grumpy. And I said, I want to talk to Monsieur Delaney. And she pointed to an entryway. And I went into the entryway and climbed the stairs and came finally to a door that said, "Welcome, David," on it. Wow. And I thought, how does he know? But obviously Baldwin had written to him and said that I was going to come and to treat me nicely. Mm-hmm. And I knocked on the door, and a voice, a very sort of warm, baritone, soft and yet clear voice said, I won't try to imitate it, "Oh, welcome, David." So I opened the door and went in, and there was a room where everything was covered in white sheets. There were no paintings visible. Well, by now I knew he was an artist, but the paintings were all covered with white sheets. He was wearing a white dashiki, and the walls were all white. So that it was a very strange sensation. And again, this is the second big change in my life. It was as if Baldwin or Jimmy had decided that I needed more growing up. Mm. So he was sending me to get Beauford Delaney, and he figured this would either destroy me or grow me up. Mm. So Beauford pointed to, well, I was starting to tell you the sensation. The sensation was of a round, brown face that sort of floated in this sea of whiteness, with the sun shining through the garret window, and it was like a spotlight on this face. And what did the face say? It didn't say welcome, but he said, "Won't you lie down?" And I thought that was rather strange, but he pointed to these two cots. And for 3 days and 3 nights, we both lay on these cots, head to head. And sometimes we got up to pee in the latrine that was in the hallway. Sometimes we ate a can of tuna fish, but mostly we either slept or talked. Sometimes it was the voice coming out of the night, sometimes it was a voice coming out of the daytime, but it was mostly his voice. And you might say this was the beginning of, well, first of all, I didn't realize I was writing a biography of Baldwin at that point, and I did not realize I was writing a biography of Beaufort, obviously. But in effect, it was a 3-day interview. He obviously didn't want to go with somebody he didn't know who looked about 16, which is what I looked very young at the time. And to get in a car and drive to Istanbul, especially if you were somebody like Beaufort, who was already worried about life in general and certainly any kind of change. So it was clear that he wanted to get to know me and wanted me to get to know him before we were going to get into a car together. He didn't yet know that we were also going to be accompanied by the mad poet, Richard. But in any case, somebody earlier asked me how I got to know Beauford Delaney. I think you did, so I'm telling that story now. So anyway, we got to, we took our time driving, and I guess I wasn't even too sure of the way, but we did have maps, and those you did not have what we have now. Right.
Ways to Turkey.
Right.
Yeah.
There are various ways. So we went through Yugoslavia. And in those days, if you went to an Iron Curtain country, you had to stay in a transit hotel. You couldn't just go and stay in a hotel. So we were in a transit hotel. And I should remind you that before I left to go to New York to get the car, Jimmy said to me, "When you pick up Beaufort, just don't lose him." Well, I thought that was strange, but then I was used to odd things happening around Jimmy. So we were in this little transit hotel, and I woke up in the middle of the night and looked over at the cot next to mine where Beaufort was supposed to be sleeping, but Beaufort wasn't there. He had disappeared. In short, I had lost him. So I was determined I was going to get up and find him, which I did. He was in the village, and he was going through a kind of problem. An episode, yeah. And he was haranguing the villagers. So I managed to get him to come down off the podium where he was on a statue like this, except the statue was of Marshal Tito. And he was haranguing the audience. So I got him back into the room and got him into bed. And then I thought, I'm going to lose him again because I've been driving for, God knows how many hours, and I'm going to go to, I can't leave him. And I can't not sleep. So I got into bed with him. And this is sort of the third major change in my life. We slept together with our arms around each other because this was the only way I could stay awake and still
get rest.
And
hold on to him.
But I held on to him, and he held on to me. And then something happened in those hours. I suddenly began to understand somehow something about Beaufort which he couldn't have told me, except to say, which he did later on, that what bothered him was the voices. And the voices called him a nigger faggot. They always called him the same thing, those two words. And somehow, it's hard to describe it, but somehow I began to hear the voices too. And I don't know how to explain that, except to say that being there in each other's arms, we shared something, which I'd never shared with anyone else.
He was telling you about himself and a deep...
Yes, and he wasn't physically saying it, but somehow I felt what he was saying. He had told me what the voices said.
And then when they came back...
When they came back, I somehow heard them too, because, well, you can imagine, I'm driving along in the car with him, and a car is going along next to us at 60 miles an hour, going this way. We're going 60 miles an hour. And he would say something like, "Did you hear what they said?" And obviously I didn't, but I was very rational, of course. A good Princeton education. I knew to say, "You could not have heard that, Beauford, because we're going 60 miles an hour than they are." And he said, "Maybe you didn't hear it, but I did."
And he heard it all his life.
Yes.
He heard it all his life. I think
exactly.
Thank you, David, for that. Profound.
Right.
A very important part of this story is a man named, Baldwin's best friend in high school was a Spanish Jew.
Oh, right.
And he was
Emil
Capoya. And when he refers to things in Notes of Native Son about handing out leaflets, to his Jewish classmates, he's referring to Emil and so on. And Emil is the person that he told when he was a preacher, and he told Emil, he talked about it with Emil, and Emil said, "I don't have any respect for you if you stay, because you can't speak the thing that you don't believe."
Right.
And Emil was also the person, I think this is maybe something that we didn't pick up on in our conversations, was that Baldwin, Jimmy, was giving you the education that he had been given by people like Emil, so that when he sent you to pick up Beauford, similarly, Emil had sent him to Beauford. Yes?
That's absolutely true, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you describe that experience for Baldwin? Or?
Yes. It's interesting. Baldwin referred to his first meeting Beauford as going through that unusual door, which is a line from an old song that he knew, or Beauford knew. And Emil had said, because Jimmy was having adolescent problems, problems with the fact that he was a preacher and no longer believed it, problems with sexuality, given what his stepfather's attitude was to both his preaching and his sexuality. He was having problems. He was 15. And Emil said to him, "You really need to go meet Beauford Delaney." And Jimmy did go to meet Beauford Delaney. He went through what he called the unusual door. And Beauford literally took him in and put him through a whole series, I think you'd call it a series that involved teaching. It involved teaching him how to see and teaching him about light and teaching him about love, maybe in a more profound way than he had experienced any of those things before. And we should at some point talk about both light and love as themes that run through Jimmy's work, and primarily because of his beginnings with Beauford. Anyway, Beauford And by the way, I could call him Beaufort because that's what he called himself, and that's what his relatives and friends in Knoxville. In Paris, obviously, people called him Beaufort.
Yeah.
But I still think of him as Beaufort because that's how it was pronounced. Anyway, Jimmy went there, and Beaufort took him on, basically, and taught him about painting, taught him about looking even in the gutter to find both the literal and the metaphorical gutter in order to find light, to find the light which can reveal love, the light which can reveal truth. We can talk later about the light, I think.
Well, I mean, one of the things that really inspired my show at Zwirner in 2016 was his essay about Beaufort. And he says that until he met Beaufort, that blackness to him, the color, was equated with the absence of light. Yeah. And Beaufort showed him that it is not the absence of light, that it's a different kind of light that comes up in paintings and in the world. And something that was very significant to me in the kind of conceptualization of the show was this idea of light presumably being absent from blackness. And throughout Beaufort's paintings and throughout Baldwin's writing, the parallel tracks are showing us that light exists in those faces and in those paintings. I have a question for you. When you first saw the work, what did you make of it?
It's a good question, a complicated one. I had gone through the unusual door too that Jimmy had gone through, except it happened to be in Paris instead of on Green Street.
Yes.
When I saw the last day before we got into the car to go to Istanbul.
Did he take the sheets down?
Yeah, I said, could I see your paintings? And he took the sheets down, and I was almost overcome by the sense of light that came out of these wonderfully large, abstract, formerly white draped, but now revealed expressions of the love which he associated with light. They were studies in light. Later, he would do different kinds of studies in light. For instance, when we were all in Istanbul and Beaufort had come, I brought him there, he painted two portraits. One was the portrait of me, which isn't relevant really here.
It's good.
Yeah, it is. But the real portrait, the important one, was one he did of Jimmy. But it's a yellow painting.
Yes.
With a lot of impasto. That is, it's very thick yellow, and you're almost overwhelmed by the yellow. But then out of the yellow comes this face, which is distorted, which he saw as Jimmy, but which for him was somehow a commentary on Jimmy coming out of the light, Jimmy being of the light. You know that painting.
Yeah, I do.
That's right, it's in the book. I think it's still in the book.
Oh, yeah. I want to ask you something about this idea of light, of seeing, because it's a prerequisite, it's a prerequisite for looking, but it's not so much a prerequisite for vision.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that happens in this wonderful book, but in all your work, is that you make great and subtle distinctions between the vision and looking. And so the vision and visionary aspect of Delaney Baldwin becomes a kind of almost, in your writing, almost, I don't think you ever really left the chapel. There are ways in which your upbringing was about faith, right? It was about
As
belief.
opposed to belief.
Yes, right. And so the faith that they felt in you was something that you gave back to them. I wondered about the domestic details. Was Jimmy supporting Beauford? And how long would they be joined together before they would separate again? Or
You mean in any given case? Or
in Istanbul that time and after?
Well, there was a pattern that had emerged. Obviously, when Jimmy was a 15-year-old, and in the next 3 years after that.
Oh, David, I'm sorry. I just want to jump in for 1 second before I forget. Jimmy sat for him nude.
Yes.
Was on the first occasion of meeting. This is what I've read.
Yes.
How did that happen?
This is a point which some people dispute. But some people say it wasn't really Jimmy, the painting. But I almost know it was, because I knew his body. When we were in Turkey together, this is a little bit seems off the track, but it really is relevant. When we were in Turkey together, we went to a little village on the Sea of Marmara because he had broken his leg. We had a party in Istanbul and he tripped on a cobblestone. I hate to say it's
Jimmy?
not very romantic. Yes.
Yes.
And so we went to this little village where he could recuperate. And what was the point I was trying to make?
We were talking about the domestic details.
The domestic details and the painting.
Yes.
Dark rapture.
Yes.
I know it was him because I had to bathe him because he had this cast on which he couldn't get wet. And I don't know whether you know about Turkish bathing. In Turkey, where you sit on a slab and there's water running and you sort of pour water over yourself. And if you have somebody with you, they'll wash your back and do that sort of thing. So I did that for him. So I knew what his body was like. I knew every aspect of his body. And so when I saw that painting, which had been in the attic of a woman somewhere up in Brewster, who got in touch with me somehow and said, I have this painting of this black man and I don't like it, I don't want it. It belonged to my husband. Well, that's another story in itself because I figured out who the husband had to have been.
A lover of one of them.
A lover of Baldwin.
Yes. I knew it was coming.
But I didn't want to say that to her because she was already
She didn't know
acting.
the deal, yeah.
Right, she did not know the deal.
Yeah.
But anyway, I knew.
Throughout your life with Baldwin, these issues would come up.
Stories,
narratives that were not shared at the time, but
right.
later. Right.
Exactly so. So anyway, where was I?
His body.
Oh, you wanted to know about the domestic thing. Well, I knew his body. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I knew sort
kidding.
of.
Yeah.
And I mean.
And the painting.
Yes, and so you asked about the domestic.
Was he the support that he was giving Beauford? Was he?
Oh, you asked about that.
Was he taking care of him in Paris? Or?
Yes, that's what I was trying to
Okay.
say. When Jimmy was young, Beauford was a kind of substitute father for him. In fact, Jimmy talked about Beauford as his spiritual father. But then Beauford's mental condition deteriorated over the years, and gradually the roles changed. And Jimmy became the spiritual father of Beaufort. And in a way, I mean, I know we have another biographer of Baldwin way in the back here, but he knows too, that Baldwin became Beaufort's sort of spiritual father, and basically took over the role of minding for him. For instance, whenever things got bad for Beaufort in Paris, Jimmy would arrange for him to come down to Saint-Paul-de-Vence, where he lived. And this became a regular pattern. So I don't know how to explain it otherwise than to say that Jimmy took responsibility for Beaufort, and this was true until the time that Beaufort died in 79.
There was so little known about the illness at that point. There was so little care, really, for people who were suffering.
Right.
And so these kind of respites in Turkey or Paris or London or wherever must have been part of the care that you could administer without actually knowing how to help.
How to do it or how to help. Yeah. I mean, Beaufort did have psychological, he tried to commit suicide in 61, and Jimmy arranged for him to see a psychiatrist in Paris, a famous psychiatrist named Dr. Ferdier. And it was interesting because Dr. Ferdier asked Beaufort to write about his life. And a lot of what I used in my biography about Beaufort's life came from the fact that the shrink asked him to talk about his life.
Yeah. To come from Knoxville, Tennessee, in Baldwin's wonderful piece about him, he says that finally he came to Paris, where I was, and he said, I have the impression that he walked, swam, crawled to get there. Did you feel that Beaufort understood that Baldwin was his family?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Beaufort was very devoted to his actual family as well.
Yeah.
And to the world that he had come from. And he was committed to painting people who were important to him, African Americans specifically, who were important to him. Ethel Waters, Marian Anderson. I mean, there were lots of people. W.C. Handy, and these people often became friends of his, too. So he was committed to that. Well, that's...
Yeah. What a good person, huh? Sorry. We've been gabbing for an hour. I just looked at David's watch, and we have.
Yeah, I guess we have.
And why don't we have a few questions for folks who feel similarly moved or not moved or have questions, who would like to know a little bit more. David lives in faraway Connecticut, so this is your opportunity to buttonhole him and ask a few questions, or I'll answer a question, whatever. Hey.
I saw a beautiful portrait by Georgia O'Keeffe of Beaufort Delaney.
Yes.
Yes.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Three, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's several of them.
Was she in Paris or?
No, they met at
Mexico.
no. They met at they met in New York.
It was sort of pre-Whitney on 8th Street.
On there was the Whitney Museum she had an before it was the museum.
So before you moved to that.
Right, because it was really interesting. You'll buy a copy of David's book and find out. But David has this really startling section about his fear of women, his mother, etc. But he would have these women who would take care of him through just attention and tenderness. So Georgia was one of them, and another figure was Elizabeth Bishop, the poet.
Yes.
And Louise Crane, and they met at Yaddo. So there would be these moments of him being, like Baldwin, taken care of by these women very gently. I would assume because they understood the fragility. And I think if you're having those delusions, which are not delusions in America, right? You're debased very early, and it's very hard to come out of that. And I think one of the things that's great about David's book is sometimes you don't come out of it, but what do you do around those issues of debasement? And it's very sweet to read and to see pictures of him with Elizabeth Bishop and Yaddo and so on. So I'm just grateful David wrote this book. It's the only one. And it's very important.
Yeah.
How's that for a selling point?
That's good.
Pretty good.
There's some funny moments in some of those relationships.
Yes.
Stieglitz, well, let's go back to Elizabeth Bishop.
Yes.
Elizabeth Bishop and Jimmy both like to drink.
A lot.
A lot, right.
Yeah.
And at Yaddo, it often was snowing when they both happened to be there as fellows. And so Jimmy would say to Elizabeth, "I'll walk you home to your cabin." And then he would walk her to her cabin. And then she'd say, "Oh, but now you've got to get back to your cabin, so I'll walk you there." And so they would do this back and forth, and they would get to be laughing and get drunker, of course.
It's hilarious.
And end up at one or the other cabin.
I have a drunk Elizabeth Bishop story. Do you want to hear it?
Yes.
Okay. When Robert Lowell, she was a great friend of Robert Lowell, and when he died, his third wife was the great writer Elizabeth Bishop, and Elizabeth Hardwick.
Right.
By the way, he had asked at some point in his delirium, in his paranoid schizophrenia, for Elizabeth Bishop to marry him. He was in love with her, and of course, just was not interested. And so when he died, Elizabeth Bishop came, and Caroline Blackwood, who was his then wife, came to Elizabeth Hardwick's house, and a mutual friend called Lizzie, as they called her, and said, and he said, "Has there been drinking?" And she said, "Drinking," and hung up the phone. So I don't know how these people got this work done, and
It was amazing.
whoa, they were. I mean, he's finishing his novel at a party.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible. It puts the rest of us to very deep shame. Please. Oh yes. Hey, Peter.
I just have a question about, I'm fascinated by the idea that you were kind of thrown into, especially given the times we're living in right now, an education on blackness and queerness at the same time.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can speak on that, and what was that like for you?
Well, as I tried to say, it was life-changing, and
The door.
yeah, going through the door.
The unusual door.
Yeah, and maybe especially the nights that I didn't just spend one night in Buford's arms or with my arms around him. for several nights when we did get to Istanbul, to Jimmy's house, he insisted that we should stay together. When Jimmy was assigning beds, Beauford said, David and I will take this bed. So, and I was honored by that. I could well have said, when that kid said to Jimmy, when Jimmy said to the kid at Harvard, I'm only black because you think you're white, I somehow understood that he could have said, I'm only queer because you think you're straight. I mean, there was something about, I mean, I was queer at that moment, if that's the right word to use. I mean, being with Beauford was an honor and somehow
an opening.
I don't know how to put it.
An opening, David, in a way, or going through that unusual door?
Yeah, it's another way of going through that unusual door. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I had homosexual experiences, so that wasn't. It wasn't that.
That wasn't the issue.
That wasn't. I mean, I knew what to do if I had to do something. But that wasn't the issue somehow. It was much deeper than that, and it was. I mean, not that sex can't be deep, but it's that isn't what it was.
It's kind of.
It was hearing his voices.
It's also I was about to say it was when you described the mind meld of, someone's head here and your head here and you're parallel but not together. It's sort of like this transmutation of souls. I think that's what you're describing, is that there's, I understand completely. Because in a way, if it was sexual, it would be over in a particular amount of time, right? But if it's 3 days of mind melt and you're just getting up to pee or eat tuna fish and you get back into bed and your minds are joining in this way, and then he says, David will sleep with me, and it's something that happens that is really very rare, I think, which is extraordinary amount of vulnerability and trust. So 3 days to ask him, may I see your paintings? He didn't say, what's behind the paint? What's going on there, Beauford? Or welcome, David. David, in each part of this story, David is observing the protocol that has been set by this queer man of color, and he's not crossing any boundary that is not offered to him. And so part of what's beautiful about the book, for me anyway, is he doesn't transgress anything Beauford doesn't want us to know from his own writing, from his painting, from this experience of having made a kind of queer family with Baldwin. One of the shows that I wanted to do, it didn't work out, was it was a show of Beauford's work, Chosen Family, and you were in it, and a bunch of other portraits. Mm-hmm. And if you go through his work, and you can see a lot online from Michael Rosenfeld, right?
Right.
Right in Rosenfeld Gallery, you'll see this kind of repetition, not emotional, but a kind of hearkening back to chosen family, people he wanted to know. It's really quite extraordinary. You should just call the gallery and ask them to send you images, because there are many of them. So I got a call one day from, wonderful, famous English director who was a friend of Beauford's. The name will come back to me over dinner, I'm sure. And he said, can you help me? He wanted to sell some of the work. And he said, but I don't want it to go to a place that's just interested in the money, because they have such spiritual value to me, that I couldn't bear I don't want to sell them if they're going to go just to someone who doesn't understand this spiritual significance. And he was talking about the paintings that Baldwin describes in his essay of, when they became more abstract, and he was living in this place with a lot of light coming through. So people who were involved with him, David, can't remember the director's name, no one ever sort of transgresses the light, really Beauford's light, which is faith. I mean, imagine, like, there's no money, there's no hope except what you're doing. I think we could learn from that. Hi, Mr. Hill.
It's Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Can we spend a minute about Beauford's art? In your introduction, you mentioned abstract number 7.
Yes.
The yellow painting that is
Yes.
unbelievably beautiful and is light.
Yes.
And
I wish we could show it,
I
but
did some research on that painting, and it is held in a collection in South Carolina. And you know, we were talking about this before. There is a city in South Carolina, instead of the D, it's a T. And
Beaufort.
yes.
you know how it's pronounced. And my question is, the Johnson family, that, where has Beauford's art ended up? In other words,
okay.
who has collected the art, and where do you see it?
There's, it's in a kind of couple of places, right? One is in Knoxville. There's a lawyer for the family,
Derek Spratley.
and he has a bunch. And then there also now you can go and read the journals, which is wonderful. But he owns things that I had never seen before when I went to Knoxville, that were just kind of extraordinary things that David had written about in his book that I had never seen. So the Marian Anderson portrait that I had never seen, and
Right.
that Beaufort said he painted it for me, and so on. So there's a lot there, and then Michael Rosenfeld has a lot. Where else, David? MoMA?
MoMA had some.
But they don't have like a bunch, right? Tom is asking one.
Usually hanging.
Yeah.
MoMA has one. The Met, I think, has one. The
Yeah.
Chicago has one.
You mean in terms, Tom? You mean in terms of where could one go to?
Also, during his life, what was it like in terms
Oh, yeah.
of acceptance, and how was he, I would say, dealt with in the art world? It would be a pretty rough place.
Yes.
It is a rough late. He was very poor, obviously. I mean, if he saw what his paintings sell for now, he wouldn't believe it.
Did he trade? He traded sometimes.
He did.
He traded sometimes, Tom, like for the way that Alice Neal would trade, right? She would trade for
with friends.
stuff for her kids, friends.
He also, it was in keeping with something you just said. If somebody wanted to buy a painting of his, he would not necessarily sell it, although that was what his. I mean, that's how he stayed alive. He needed to sell the paintings.
Yeah.
But if you came in to his studio, and I saw this happen. When Pam and I went, my wife and I went back there years later and took Beaufort to a performance, one of Josephine Baker's many farewell performances at the Olympia. There was somebody, I think it was then, or maybe it was another time, but someone came in and he said, "That painting's not for sale." And I asked him later, why isn't it for sale? He said, "Because I don't like him." He wasn't going to have one of his babies, as it were, being taken by someone that he didn't like, or that he somehow didn't understand what he was doing, what the significance of the yellow was, or of the light. That isn't very clear, but
No, it is clear, because I think,
yeah,
Tom,
Pam,
if you had a, let's say you were very interested in pursuing the person, if you emailed me, the person I would give you was the lawyer's name, because he has more of a kind of sense of where things are.
yeah, he does.
But this director, and it's going to kill me, he had a lot of abstractions in London. So, and they had been very close. So it was clear that at one point he had taken care of Beauford, and in paying him back,
I wish I remember who that is.
it's going to come to me, gave him 3 paintings. So I think that a lot of it, again, sort of like the Alice Neal model of like trading or Arbus, people who didn't have a market, they would trade you for services or their kids or whatever. So I think that the lawyer is the person that I would go to.
Yeah, Derek Spratley.
Yeah.
This person.
Hello,
I think-
hello.
No, I don't know, but there might be
I can't hear you.
directors in Paris who have some of this work, and I'm thinking of the woman.
Madame Duclozel? Yeah,
This is David's
This is my
wife.
wife.
This is David's wife.
yeah, yeah. He lived with her for 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
She donated many of them to the Pompidou Center. And the Pompidou Center has some of his best big abstractions.
There's also, Pam, when I went to Saint Paul de Vence, I had a very weird few days. And there was a woman who had been a lover of David, I mean, it goes,
Jill,
an English woman,
Jill.
Jill, who had been a lover of David Baldwin's. And she would speak, David didn't want to learn French, and she would go around with David. And in her house, she had stuffed all these things from the family coming to kind of raid the house after Baldwin died. And there were some exquisite little ones that she had. But she also has a kind of storage somewhere. And when I tried to get to them or try to help her find a conservator and all that, because some of them were just like a mess, she just stopped communicating with me. So a lot of the trails end up kind of nowhere, because the circumstances were so strange often. I'm sorry, you had your hand up, yeah.
Well, it's a simple question, but you mentioned there have been allusions to Alice Neal, Georgia Constantine,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking of that portrait. Am I correct in thinking that was painted while he was in Harlem, in New York?
Who he? Buford?
Yeah.
I don't think, did she ever, I never saw her paint him.
Well, anyway, the main question is, were the portraits mostly painted early in his career?
No, throughout.
Because so many of the paintings that I've seen that I've really appreciated and enjoyed looking at were abstractions
Yes.
painted later when he was in Paris. But I would love to see some portraits of him.
Oh, you should look up the one of David. It's really beautiful, actually. It's full of
He did. It's
youth and presence.
He captures my prissiness. But anyway, that's an interesting
Yeah.
point. He never stopped painting portraits,
No.
and relatively representational portraits. I mean, he would look for something in the person and try to somehow capture that. And he never stopped painting portraits. But he started doing abstractions fairly early. In the 40s, he was doing some. He was experimenting, and he never stopped doing that either. So really, the abstractions and the portraits are parallel.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yes, and then the young man upstairs.
Hearing two elements, one about the cultural milieu of Paris in the 60s onward, but also this notion of limits and borders of trust and transgression.
Yes.
Who else did Beauford trust to see his works when they were in the studio? And might have he been trusted enough to be at the table, perhaps, cafes, etc.
And talk about the painting.
His art.
Yeah. There were several painters whom he had a kind of trust that made it possible to talk about paintings. First of all, Jimmy was a good judge of painting. I mean, he actually understood Beauford's painting, even though he didn't talk about it very much. But there were several painters. One, I don't know whether, Ellis Wilson. You ever heard of Ellis Wilson? He was a great friend of Baldwin's, an African-American painter who painted mainly scenes in Haiti. Then there was, trying to think of his name, Palmer Hayden.
Yes.
Who was a good friend, and with whom he spent a lot of time and talked about painting. Then there was someone called, Larry, can't think of his last name. But anyway, he died tragically in Paris, but they used to get together often and talk about painting. So he did have people he was always involved with other painters. Even when he first came to New York from Boston, after he left Knoxville, he went to Boston and actually had some formal training there as well, and did a lot of portrait painting, sort of street portraits, charcoal drawings of people. Then when he came to New York, he got to know people like Augustus Savage, Austin. There were lots of people, painters you could probably mention from that period, including Ellis Wilson.
And Georgia.
Georgia O'Keeffe,
Yeah.
yes. And
That's
he
who you were
spent a lot of
referring to
time.
as Georgia.
Yeah. He did, and they did talk about painting.
Yeah.
And he spent a lot of time in the Stieglitz gallery. Stieglitz was interested in what he was doing.
Do you have any memory of going to a museum or a gallery with Beauford?
Going where?
To a museum or a gallery with Beauford?
Trying to think. It would have been here in New York.
Yeah.
No, I think we did do. No, I don't.
No.
I don't.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am. Hi. Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. So it's a related question to the Georgia O'Keeffe relationship, which I know both Georgia O'Keeffe and Beaufort attended art street courses
Mm-hmm.
or students. I was just curious what influence or, if that influenced or shaped his art at all, since he came from Boston and Knoxville and during his time in New York.
You mean in terms of what he was studying, or?
Studying and if that influenced his style, because I know a lot of names of that period.
Oh. What do I think ultimately, did he have influences based on, going from Knoxville to Boston to New York to Paris?
Yes.
Were there artists that he studied and looked at?
Yes. Some of them are fairly obvious. He was a great fan of Cézanne. He was. He loved Picasso. He went to museums. I didn't happen to go with him.
Yeah.
But he spent a lot of time in museums, both in Paris and in New York. And so, yes, there were painters who influenced him. Matisse was an important. Chagall, sort of obvious ones.
The French ones.
Yes, the French ones. Yeah.
One more question? Any more? Yes, sir. Hi. Hey, how are you?
Could someone describe his personality? There was a documentary where Baldwin, in the beginning of the documentary, wakes up and he's just sleeping on a mattress.
Right.
In some sort.
In
And
Istanbul.
later is with all these students. He doesn't take the students back to his apartment. He takes them to Beaufort Delaney's, I think. Studio.
Oh yeah, that's a lovely
And
scene.
Beaufort Delaney, even though he doesn't speak, he seems so alert and so engaged.
And attuned.
Little bit that you can see of him, and yet everyone talks about him, and no one sort of says, "Oh, he was funny, or silent." Or, I'm just curious.
I don't know. I get the impression from what David was saying from his book that he was a pretty powerful presence, and it's not a verbal presence. It's someone who's significant, and I think in that footage that you're describing, you can see the pride he has in the way that Baldwin is talking, and yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and a sort of pride, really. There's so few of us who get acknowledged in any way. And what I want to thank David for, and what I want to thank Baldwin for, and what I want to thank Delaney for is the acknowledgement of the extraordinary beauty, but also what David shared tonight, this heartbreaking pain and a kind of debasement that is always looking for elevation. I think that's pretty good character to me. Anyway, thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.